We can gather once again, quickly, now. Anyone? Anyone? Is anyone listening? Boone? Haida? Okay, Scott, I think it's up to you to just start talking.
Let me get my presentation up. Remind me with this slideshow. I'm on the. Let's see if I can.
Are you in the same one as Lisa? Or?
Yeah, just these windows.
Oh, that's right. You're a Mac guy.
Yeah, I can't fit. Where's the slideshow button? There's usually like a button.
Yeah, how do we get it on the screen?
Where's the button for slideshow?
That
it is.
one.
Yeah.
But we're not on the screen.
Ooh.
There we are.
Is there a, there's no clicker, but there's a, this.
Yeah, there's that.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to try to build on Lisa's presentation on the greenhouse gas estimates and offset estimates, and talk to you about, I guess, the finance part of the feasibility study. And so one of the things that we did as part of the study was did a short carbon market assessment, understanding that a lot of end users aren't already active in the carbon market, and so we wanted to provide some background on the carbon market and who some of the buyers are, what the prices look like, to help provide some more context for the financial analysis. I'm also going to touch briefly at the end of this presentation on some of the legal questions. So let me get started here. So just to go straight to some of the key findings, and I'll talk about each of these in the following slides, is that the first and most important thing to remember is that offsets from tidal restoration projects at the moment are only eligible in the voluntary offset market. So we'll talk about the difference between voluntary and compliance markets, but compliance markets like we have in California right now don't recognize offsets from tidal restoration. So the buyers from these offsets, of these offsets, are voluntary buyers at the moment. In the voluntary market, an important point to know is that offsets with what we call high co-benefits. These are high other environmental benefits besides climate mitigation. So it could be climate adaptation benefits, habitat benefits, and offsets with high scarcity, like blue carbon, sell at better prices in the voluntary market. So we have a range of prices that we see in the voluntary market, and I'll show you that in projects that are scarce and that have high co-benefits sell at better prices, and that's what we would expect with blue carbon offsets. And then the last thing I hope you take away is that the demand in the voluntary market right now, over the last few years, it's more constrained than when we see in compliance markets because they're voluntary commitments to buy offsets. But the trend is increasing, and we also have some new future sources of demand in the voluntary market from new programs that are going to start rolling out in 2021. One in particular related to international aviation could substantially increase the demand for voluntary offsets. So it's an important development to keep in mind for all voluntary offset developers. So just to review again, what is a compliance carbon market? Well, buyers of compliance offsets, they're regulated by the amount of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions that they can emit. and they have to either buy an allowance or a permit that's issued by the state, for example, in the case of California, or they can buy an offset from a project that's approved. And buyers of offsets, that's their primary motivation is compliance with those greenhouse gas regulations. In the U.S., the primary compliance market is in California. That's and particularly for offsets, it is the main market for compliance offsets. There's also a cap and trade market in the Northeast. It's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI for short. Offsets are a component of that program in concept. In practice, there's, I think, only one small offset project that's been done there. Primarily, the reason is that prices are much lower in that market than in California. So offset developers who can generate an offset have an incentive to sell those into the California compliance market. Buyers, the sort of simple math that they do, compliance buyers, is they'll buy an offset in the compliance market when it's below the price of an allowance. So in the California market, you see offsets trade at some discount to allowances, which are the permits that the state issues. I think it's around 10 to 15% at the moment. So they need a price incentive. But as I mentioned before, the key thing for this project at the moment is that tidal wetlands are not eligible in either of those systems in California or in concept in the RGGI system to generate offsets. Now, that's not to mean that they will never be allowed. I think some of the discussion this morning highlights some of the uncertainties that still exist in the science, and that we need to demonstrate through pilot projects. So there is a pathway for new project types to be added to these systems, and at this point, I think tidal wetlands is still at the sort of design phase and needs to sort of more proof of concept to be allowed into these systems in the future. So what we're left with today are the voluntary carbon markets, and those markets are the buyers of voluntary carbon offsets. They're motivated by corporate social responsibility, and that's these commitments. Part of those CSR plans are voluntary commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is a growing trend. Companies realize that employees, customers, and investors, want to work with and do business with and invest in companies that are environmentally responsible. They see greenhouse gas emissions and climate change as an increasingly important issue, and one that could be regulated in the future. So you see even recently more companies adopting climate commitments on a voluntary basis. The main voluntary offset programs in the marketplace are the VCS, or the Verified Carbon Standard, which was mentioned this morning. In the land use space, it's the primary standard, and accounts for well over 50% of the offsets that are issued amongst voluntary land use projects. But there are also two other voluntary standards, the American Carbon Registry and the Climate Action Reserve. So you find buyers of offsets really agnostic about these standards. What's important is that there is a standard, that it shows, it's a rigorous, independent, third-party standard that they rely on the integrity of those standards, so they don't have to do the due diligence on these projects themselves. They just rely on certification. An important thing to remember, and we in the offset space, we have to remind ourselves that companies have other options besides offsets to reducing their footprint. They can take on internal efficiency investments. They have a big focus on renewable energy. Electric batteries and powered vehicles is another for transportation industry. Is another area of focus. So carbon offset's just one of those tools that they can use to reduce their footprint after they've done maybe some of these other things. And the good news is, as we know from this morning, tidal wetlands restoration is eligible under the VCS to generate offsets. So unlike the compliance markets, we can generate offsets in the voluntary market that can be sold to these voluntary buyers. So what do these voluntary buyers look like? This is some data from a report that was done looking at buyers of forest carbon offsets, which is really the primary category so far in the carbon market from the land use sector has been forestry. On the top, you can see most of the buyers of those come from the U.S. and Western Europe. These are corporate buyers, mostly multinational companies in consumer-facing industries. So you can see the industries there on the bottom, sort of the big industries being energy, events and entertainment, the finance and insurance business, transportation, and technology. I'm not sure. I think that might focus in. I'm not sure where it's covered there, but technology is an important part of that sector. In the Pacific Northwest, I thought it'd be useful to give you an idea of some of some of the buyers of carbon offsets here. Microsoft has been one of the big buyers historically of voluntary carbon offsets. They've supported projects around the world, but they've also been interested in supporting projects in this region. And that's a pretty common objective of many of the buyers as they look for projects with high co-benefits and in locations where they have operations, so where they have employees, customers, so that these projects are public facing. And another big buyer, and actually Kyler is here from the Climate Trust, but they've been another buyer of offsets in the U.S. and in this region, and work on behalf of other end users to acquire offsets for them for reducing their footprint. And these are just examples. This isn't an exhaustive list, but some of the prominent examples. I wanted to mention two other sort of newer companies have made commitments. Amazon has made a commitment just a couple of weeks ago, made several environmental commitments, includes electrical vehicles, but it also includes a $100 million commitment to fund reforestation projects to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So I think that's kind of an interesting, we talk about tidal forested wetlands and the opportunity here. Those are effectively reforestation projects that would be in the backyard of a pretty big company here in the Northwest. And then just show you the diversity of companies. Kaiser Permanente, healthcare company here in the Pacific Northwest, who's also made commitments to reduce its emissions and to use offsets as part of its strategy. Understanding that I think sort of the strong link between human health and climate change. So that just gives you an example of some of the companies that are out there using offsets to meet their climate commitments. A lot of them are ramping up their commitments. There's been, historically, companies have looked only at their direct emissions, as well as their emissions from like electricity usage. There's a trend now towards looking at their whole supply chain, so what they call Scope 3 emissions. And there's now commitments, companies are making commitments to reduce those, and they're oftentimes, multiples higher than their direct emissions. So, so I think that from a trend perspective, and we see this in the project development sector, there's still a lot of interest in developing new projects to meet this demand. Scope 3, yeah. So this is like looking at sort of those indirect emissions, and it's significant in like consumer goods, like food companies, beverage companies that have like a big emissions footprint from their agricultural supply chain. So looking at ways they can reduce emissions within that context. This just kind of gives you an idea of what the demand has been for voluntary carbon offsets. And with some apologies, the data, we don't have 2017 and 2018 data yet. I think hopefully there's a new survey that is in process that will shed some more light on this. This is the most recent survey on the voluntary carbon markets. And it shows you the total demand for offsets, including all project types, and then in the red bars, the sort of forest carbon projects. This would range from avoided conversion of forest, improved management of forest, as well as restoration of forests. And you can see that's about 20% of the marketplace. It's a significant component overall. Thank you. That is millions of tons of offsets that are measured in carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's about, if you sort of look at that, about 75 million tons a year of demand. This gives you a better picture of what that demand looks like by project type. Again, land use is just one option. There are many other types of offset projects related to things like landfill methane, wind energy. In the sort of gold bars there, you see the land use related offsets from the forestry sector, and you can see those sort of small blue boxes are the average prices. And you can see that we have a range of prices across offset types. You can see some very low offset prices for things like large hydro and even landfill methane, around $2 a ton. And you can see for the land-based projects, anywhere from $4 to $9 to $10 a ton. And this data it's from 2016, but it's not the market in the voluntary market's not too far off of these prices still. So again, I think it just highlights the projects with high co-benefits, which tend to be in the land use sector, do tend to fetch higher prices. And you can imagine if you're a company like Amazon or Microsoft and you're talking about your CSR and you're putting out your sustainability report, it's a lot nicer to talk about the forest in the Pacific Northwest that you restored and all the habitat benefits and the public recreation benefits and the water quality benefits than it is to show the picture of the landfill with, where you've reduced the methane gas from. So it's also a better site visit too, if you, for sure. And then in terms of future demand, I mentioned the international aviation sector. This is a big development in the voluntary sector that people have been following for a couple of years now. International aviation falls outside of the UN Paris agreements. So each of the countries that are part of the Paris agreements in their national inventories, they include emissions from domestic aviation, but they don't include emissions from aviation from flights that start in one country and end in a different country. Nobody actually accounts for those. And so the UN has been telling the aviation industry, you need to come up with a plan to reduce emissions from this sector because it's quite significant. It's, I think, about 3% of global emissions, and it's growing. And they said, if you don't come up with a plan, we will. So they came up with an industry-wide plan that covers, and the acronym is CORSIA, which is the Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. And the idea is that, again, it only covers emissions from international aviation, and that they committed as an industry to carbon neutral growth starting in 2021. So basically freezing emissions where they are at 2021, and to the extent they're adding new routes and new flights to existing routes, that all that incremental growth in emissions would need to be compensated for. And offsets are going to be a big part of how they do that. There's not a lot of other options right now in terms of like biofuels for planes. And so this is an estimate of what that demand for offsets would look like starting in 2021 and going out to 2035. And so there's a phase-in of countries that are going to be subject to CORSIA. Some start sooner than others, and so you see it ramp up around 2026. But it's a significant amount of offsets. Over this period of time, it adds up to about 1.5 to 3.5 billion tons of offset demand, depending on the growth in airline travel. At 1.5 billion, I mean, we were saying before that we see about 75 million tons of emissions per year or demand per year from the voluntary market. So over 15 years, you get, it's a little bit over 1 billion tons of demand. So this would, even at the low end of their estimates, would double, more than double the demand in the voluntary offset market. The caveat is that the rules, it's a very political process, similar to like the UN. So there's, sort of negotiation between all the countries that are, the aviation agencies in these countries that are part of these commitments. And so there's still some work to be done on exactly which offsets qualify. But there's, the idea that land use would be a big part of this is pretty much agreed, and they're working through other technical issues to make sure things like double counting don't occur, so that there's not emissions that like from offsets that get accounted for at the national level, and then also towards this commitment here. So it's something to keep your eye on. It could really push offset prices up. Yeah, Wolf. Yeah, so the comment was that this is only going to govern international aviation. So like in the EU, I think domestic aviation is already covered under their compliance scheme. In the US, where it's not, I mean, some of these airlines already have voluntary programs to reduce those emissions. Those should continue. So it shouldn't take away from what we already see. It should just add. And then I guess I just wanted to kind of come back to this point, when we look longer term, we did these analyses over 40 years. So the question is, what's the scenario over 40 years for offset prices and offset sales? And so it makes sense to think about regulatory markets over that time frame. And in California, as opposed to RGGI, I mean, we do see offsets being used today by regulated companies to meet their commitments, and forestry has a big share of those of that market. And as I said before, there are pathways for new protocols that are contained within the rules of the Air Resources Board, which is the agency that regulates the cap and trade program in California. And they've looked at years ago blue carbon and as they do for all new projects, they want to see demonstration projects. They want to see the science get proven out, and they want to see the accounting, the carbon accounting methodologies, be applied to make sure that there's a lot of integrity, because from their perspective, every offset that gets purchased and used, another ton from the smokestack goes up into the atmosphere. So they have to be absolutely sure that, that the atmosphere is whole when these offsets are generated and sold. And just to give you an idea of pricing, I think on the previous slide for land use projects, we saw like $4 to $10. It's sort of a range in the voluntary market. In the compliance market, we see better prices and offsets in the sort of $12 to $14 a ton range. And the demand, I didn't show it here, but deeper demand as well. So it is a market worth striving towards, these compliance markets in the future, because the demand and the pricing is better, provide a stronger platform for blue carbon projects. So maybe I'll just stop there and ask if there are any other questions or comments on the market side.
Thank you for all this. I have two questions. One, as you mentioned at the very end, that the pricing in the compliance market is stronger. And do you see that the price of the compliance or the permits will act as a permanent price ceiling on like voluntary offsets? And like, I think we can all agree that it needs to be higher in price.
Right.
And so how do we get through that ceiling? And my second question is that you mentioned that the offsets with co-benefits are priced higher, which, as we saw from the first presentations, that we're going to need that for blue carbon. And how do you see those co-benefits getting valued higher? Is there like a methodology for that, or is it purely like people are like, oh, I want to pay for that one, so it raises the price?
That's a great question. So on the first question, in terms of compliance markets, in California, the market has been built in with a price escalation. Allowances have an automatic price escalation every year, and they go up at the consumer price index plus 5%. And so that's a good thing. I mean, so we've seen prices started out, I think they started with a $10 a ton price for allowances when they first were auctioning off allowances in that program. And now allowances themselves are trading somewhere around $17 a ton. So that's not to say that's the right price or that's enough, but I mean, that's sort of a policy discussion. But we have seen policy proposals outside of California, like on the federal basis, of carbon prices around $40 a ton, which is maybe closer to what the social cost of carbon has been estimated at. So we do some sensitivity analysis when we did the financial assessment. Of course, it's dependent on having offset, generating an offset and having a net greenhouse gas benefit. But I think we're at a low. I mean, prices are low to what we should expect going forward. Now, in terms of the other co-benefits and how can you better, I mean, it's like to date, we've not done a great job about that. We said, hey, these projects have co-benefits, so you should pay more per ton of carbon. And, the benefits are not measured in these other co-benefits are, maybe acres of habitat or some other measure of improvement in water quality, or in the case of coastal wetlands, improved resilience to flooding. It had nothing to do with tons of carbon, but we add on this kind of, $1 a ton or $2 a ton. But there has been some newer efforts underway to better value those co-benefits. In the case of coastal resiliency, that's sort of an exciting new area. I think it's up. We happen to be working with the Nature Conservancy on developing an approach to that, and some of the standards bodies. There's an organization called Verra. They operate the verified carbon standard. They've added a new standard that's called the verified impact standard, and or it's a sustainable development verified impact standard. So this is the idea that a lot of companies have sustainable development goals. What if you do a project that helps reach one of those goals? If you increase coastal resiliency, that's climate resiliency is one of the goals. And so how do you quantify that? How do you create a market and sell that? So that's still pretty early stage. I mean, I think we're moving in the right direction. What's the market for that? How do you create, how do you value that? Those are all questions we're still working through. But maybe, 10 years from now, we'll have a lot more answers there. 5 years, yeah.
Yeah, I was. Can't tell if it's, yeah, it's on. So is the California market restricted to the state of California, or does it have a service area that is broader than California for the offsets?
Yeah, good question, complicated answer. It used to be open to any project located in the continental U.S. and I think Southeast Alaska. And then sort of the politics of, so that was sort of for the first phase of the program, which is coming to an end in 2020. I think the program started in 2015. And then they extended the program now to 2030. But over this new compliance period, they put on restrictions for offsets that don't have a direct environmental benefit to California. So that's kind of how do you interpret that, right? If you're in the state of California, you figure, well, that automatically has direct environmental benefit. But if you're maybe somewhere in the Pacific Northwest and you have other waterways that connect to California, I think some people will be arguing that, there's a gray area that they're still trying to define. Once you get, further away to sort of you're on the East Coast, I think people are thinking that will be harder to make those arguments, and they put a cap on the amount of offsets that can be used from, basically out of state. Right now, a compliance entity they can meet up to 8% of their compliance requirement with offsets. So they can't, so the other 92% they have to buy an allowance for that. In 2021, the offset limit is going to be cut in half. They can only use 4%, and only 2% of that can come from out of state. And then it's going to go up to 6% in 2025 or in 2026, and 3% can come from out of state. So, it's mainly just about the politics, about trying to, satisfy some folks concerned in California about the environmental impact of say emissions on people in California. So the offsets and some of these co-benefits also need to accrue more to the state of California.
In 2020, there will be legislation again in Washington for a cap-and-trade-like program. So call your congressperson and let them know what you want. And that, what I understand from Ruben Carlisle, who's a sponsor of this, that offsets will be required to come from Washington State. So it would be a boon to a project like this.
Yeah, thank you, Wolf. I didn't include it in the presentation, but in the report, we did make reference to some other other state level cap and trade programs in the Pacific Northwest, like over the sort of medium term, that could also create more demand for these kind of offsets. So that's, an important thing to keep in mind as well. Okay, so maybe I'll move on to the financial assessment just to kind of keep us on time. This part of the project, we took the emission reduction estimates that Lisa went over this morning, and we applied dollars and cents to them to estimate what would be the financial impact, sort of net finance that could be brought to a project if it were developed as a blue carbon offset project. So here are the key findings, and this is consistent with this morning, is that carbon offsets and therefore revenue generation is possible in some tidal forested wetland scenarios, and it's more questionable in the case of the non-forested wetlands, dependent on methane primarily. The minimum scale for those carbon revenues to cover fairly fixed carbon costs in the case of these tidal forested wetlands projects is about 500 hectares, so it's more than 1,000 acres. And there's still some more work to refine these projections, and some of the data that we've used on biomass growth for Sitka spruce, it may not be entirely applicable to the wetland settings, and so there's just more data we need on growth rates in those wetland settings. So we had to make a few assumptions on carbon prices. We talked about $4 to $10 as a range for land use projects. We used $10 a ton price. I think these have very high co-benefits, high scarcity, and there's not a big. It's a high scarcity. There's not a big supply of these credits. So we think $10 a ton is a fair price to sell these at. We applied a 5% growth rate to that over these 40 years. I think that's fairly conservative. In 2050, you get to about $40 a ton, which is probably where we need to be much sooner than 2050 in terms of carbon pricing. But we did run some sensitivity analysis around that to show what the results were at higher rates, at up to 10% growth a year and lower rates of 0%. On the cost side, and these are just carbon-related costs, right? So all the restoration costs, which are very high, is not part of the analysis here. We're just looking at the incremental carbon project costs, and there's two different types of costs. One is the upfront project development. So this is getting your project registered. In our analysis, we assume that would be about $150,000, and again, that's fairly fixed, regardless of the scale of the project. It includes about $100,000 of costs to put together all the analyses behind what's referred to up here as the PDD, which is the project design description, it's the document that gets where the methodology is applied, all the supporting analysis is attached to it, and that goes through an audit process, which is referred to as validation. It's a pretty rigorous process. There's site visits involved, and that we've estimated conservatively $50,000 for that. So there's not a lot of sort of cost built in here for additional data collection for baseline values, which is something that we know is still in many settings is still lacking. So we assume that there's either other funding to cover some of that data, maybe on a regional basis, but it's not included in borne by the projects we've analyzed here. And then on an ongoing basis, there's costs for monitoring the carbon project. Under the voluntary standards, this has to occur at least every 5 years, and that's to be able to determine if there's been a reversal, which we talked about earlier. So we assume that the projects here would be monitored every 5 years, and that every monitoring event you'd have a $75,000 of cost. We did build in some cost increases year on year of 5%, like we did on carbon prices, and you can see we've allocated some of that money for field data collection and some of that money for preparing the monitoring report and having that audited, which is the verification here. So taking the greenhouse gas estimates that Lisa presented And using these assumptions on carbon prices and carbon costs, we developed projections of the net cash flows, both carbon revenues, carbon cost, and net cash flows over 40 years. And we also calculated what the value of those net cash flows were on a present value basis. So in terms of today's dollars, if you value those, and for that we used a discount rate of 4%. So these are these correspond to the restoration scenarios that Lisa went over. And again, for an illustrative 100-hectare project over 40 years. And, in the case of conversion, using our base assumptions, we didn't have any offset generation in the conversion to tidal fresh and tidal mesohaline wetlands, so there's no revenues associated with those projects. In the case of the tidal forested wetland, you see the amount of revenues over 40 years estimated between $300,000 and $1.1 million. Some of the costs are below that, or all of the costs are below that, and again, this includes an escalator for cost of 5% over time. So on an absolute basis, that totals about $2.2 million over 40 years. So you see, at the scale of 100 hectares, the carbon revenues aren't enough to cover the carbon costs. And on a present value basis, that's, again, that's the present value of those cash flows in terms of today's dollars at 4%. But still red. Yeah, question? Yeah, the question I think was, how does it compare to an upland forest? And probably, when we talk about upland forests, there's different types of activities. And I mentioned before, we have like restoration, we have improved management, and we have avoided conversion of those areas. If you look at the restoration side of upland forest, that would be comparable to this. It's going to be scale dependent, but the thing that's similar is that what makes those hard projects in the carbon market is a lot of the revenues they don't get, they get generated when biomass grows, and so the first 10 years or so you have very little biomass growth in their back end loaded projects. But it's scale dependent, and I have a slide here to show you what it looks like at different scales. I think that's all these costs that we have here, the carbon costs, those are fairly fixed no matter how large your project. Same sort of relative effort in terms of putting together the project design and getting it validated and doing the monitoring are relatively the same, whether it's a 50-acre project or a 500-acre project. But the amount of revenues you generate obviously is gonna scale. So this is what it looks like at different scales and also at different carbon price assumptions. And the central price assumption, again, is that 5% annual growth. That's in the box there. And you can see, again, this is in hectares, but you can see the different areas there. But when you get, for example, on the 2/3 tidal forested wetland, around 500 hectares and above, as long as you get some sort of growth, and even at 0% annual price increase, you're about break even over that 40-year time frame. But if you get carbon price growth of around 5%, for example, at 500 hectares, you flip to positive number, about $700,000 of net cash flows over that 40-year time frame. And you can see for the 100-hectare project, you need maybe a larger project or higher carbon prices. I mean, the thing to think about is, in terms of revenues, is that they both, whether you get double the price for carbon or you double the project size, it doubles the revenues. So you can get there by increasing the scale or increasing the price. And then this is not a very exciting slide, but just to at least cover the Skagit. And as Lisa mentioned, In the base case examples that we ran, we didn't see any, we weren't estimating or projecting any greenhouse gas emission reductions, and therefore, it was mainly cost. I will say this, and just to sort of be clear, you could still have a net greenhouse gas benefit in the restoration scenario. It could just be, it could still be a net sink of carbon, but if it's a smaller net sink than it was in the baseline scenario, when you consider methane and emissions, it doesn't generate any incremental benefit. And so that's what we're measuring here is incremental benefit, incremental greenhouse gas reductions in the project scenario as compared to what was already occurring in the baseline scenario. Yeah, Jude.
One comment I wanted to add about the Skagit results and the context for this is that all of the projects that we were looking at were salmon restoration projects within the Skagit watershed. And what we had looked at was, would it be feasible to do this overlay as a co-benefit of blue carbon? So these are projects that were really identified not based on their carbon value, but on salmon habitat and exploring whether, So these are really valuable projects that are going on. It's just not that they're not generating the carbon benefit as a co-value.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. Yeah, and I think Steve, we've always said this, just because it's not having a net GHG benefit doesn't mean they shouldn't be done. There are lots of other compelling reasons, and you got to remember too, and it's been said before, there are a lot of uncertainties in this data as well that we're working with. So, any other questions or comments before I move on the financial assessment? Yeah, Steve.
Not so much on the financial, Scott, but just following up on that last one. Is this on? Sounds the same to me. When we think also about the net greenhouse gas benefits, one of the things that we're driven towards here is the near-term benefits in recognizing the methane emissions impact within near-term decades, and that's what brings it down. Of course, for us geologists and ecologists, we think longer terms than just a few decades. And so the Snohomish in particular, maybe I'll come back to this later, is going to be sequestering carbon for a very long time, centuries. And so over that kind of time scale, it's good to be thinking now to be instilling more of that kind of carbon accumulation into the landscape, because it's a long-term benefit that will hopefully future generations, if they're still around, will benefit from. But in terms of carbon financing, we're driven by having to think about the near-term decades, and we have to factor in the methane into that. Yeah, just wanted to make that point.
All right, let me, just in the interest of time, I know I'm at about time, just to kind of give you a overview of the legal analysis, because we were also asked to look at a very high level, what are some of the potential legal issues and particularly ownership issues around offsets that should also be considered. And so here are some of the key findings, and this is applicable not just to blue carbon, but any sort of land-based carbon, is that it's important to know that offset ownership is evidenced by holding land title. So the sort of presumption is that the landowner owns the carbon rights for any activity that's occurring on the land, but can transfer that, via an agreement to another party. As we think about carbon projects and how they could be designed and who would receive the offsets, you have to sort of keep that in mind, that landowners we start with them and they can transfer those to other parties. We didn't do a deep dive into this, and there is actually some work, a deeper dive going on right now that I think, is it William and Mary? University of Rhode Island is doing some more work around some of the legal issues around blue carbon that apply, that more generally applicable across the U.S., which I know they're looking specifically. They've done some case studies, and I think they've spoken to some folks here at the Tulalip tribes about that. So I think there's more to come on some of the nuances around offset ownership and how to navigate that. But the important point is, when you're talking about public lands or tribal lands, is that there's often these administrative rules, to refer to them generically, that can specify or maybe are vague about the authority of that administrative agency to transact carbon credits. And so that's, we found that's kind of a, in many cases, on public lands, where maybe there's specific language around a state agency's ability to sell timber or sell grazing rights, but they're not as specific around carbon. And so, and each agency is different. So we do see precedent projects on public lands and on tribal lands, but each one of them, there's sort of a separate analysis that has to be undertaken to understand the authority that's been granted to these agencies through a different statute to establish that they can transact in the market. We did look more specifically at the issue of lands that were acquired or restored with funding from the Recreation and Conservation Office in Washington State. And there's some, I guess, good news there is there's some guidance from them that carbon offsets could be generated from projects on those lands, but they have to comply with some of the existing rules there. So I'll just go over those real briefly here. Again, this is the language in the Verified Carbon Standard around how to demonstrate project ownership. And as I said, it comes down to, in the case of land use projects, having a statutory property or contractual right in the land. It can also be established, though, with an agreement with the holder of those rights. So that's sort of the critical language and to sort of help guide project developers as they're thinking about these projects and who might own the carbon and who would have to be a party to the transaction. Land ownership is a variety of land ownerships here in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere. And as I mentioned, it's sort of different considerations for each setting. When we talk about the authority to develop a carbon offset project, again, that on public lands, it's important that each agency, that there's a review of the administrative rules with the internal counsel of that agency. And as I said, we've seen projects, forest carbon projects on federal and state lands, and they all go through a separate process at that state or federal agency because they all have different rules that and sort of different sort of boxes that they have to work within. I guess, yeah, just to mention in the Pacific Northwest, there is some carbon project in development in King County. It actually happens to be on RCO funded land as well. So, I mean, we do have some precedents of publicly owned land and agencies navigating this process. And, tribal lands, I think, very, very similar to public lands, that there's sort of land rights and land use rights are often established in different administrative rules, and so it's important to review those. As I said before, there are precedent carbon projects on tribal lands. There's a lot of them in the California compliance market, so we know that it's been successfully navigated. In the state of Washington, the Colville tribe has a large project that's been registered in California But again, everybody's going to be different, and that sort of process has to occur for each project owner. Private lands are the easiest. We don't have these sort of administrative rules to have to navigate, and so if you get sort of individual landowner who decides to undertake a restoration project, there's no questions about their authority to do it. There are, though, those cases where potentially where those lands get funded by the RCO, or where restoration is funded by the RCO, which is, I mentioned before. There's been some, let me stop there.
Sorry, can I ask a question from the previous level? Because we're not, in all cases, talking about limits. We're talking about title spaces, which have different governance, especially if you're coming out to coastal areas. Intertitles are all public. It's just a little different when you're talking about
Yeah.
intertitle versus place where you're planting.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think this sort of new resource that's being developed by the law department at University of Rhode Island is going to get into some of those issues with like submerged lands and where you draw the boundary. So my takeaway from what they've been talking about so far is, the further you go upland, maybe into these tidal forested wetlands, you'll have less boundary issues. It's maybe in that low marsh area that it starts to become questionable as to where land ownership for the state starts and where the private or tribal owner.
And then, sorry, I had another question around, so if we were talking about oil and gas, for instance, natural gas, then there are above land and below ground rights. Has that come up in conversation in terms of carbon sequestration, or is it?
Yeah, I haven't, no. I haven't heard of those conversations coming up as to whether it made a difference, whether carbon was stored below or above ground. I think there's another question, though.
Yeah, based on what I'm hearing or what I'm hearing here, I was just thinking of, it sounds like there's opportunity in carbon offset projects on riparian areas. And so if a landowner wants to expand, or is encouraged to expand his buffer from 0 to 150 feet, there is a potential for a carbon offset there.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think the question when we talk about riparian buffers and carbon is scale, getting back to like an order of magnitude that you're talking like around 1,000 acres. And so, and then you're talking about how can I sort of aggregate or collect a group of landowners who are all doing that, who collectively can have that sort of a scale to help offset some of the costs. But in theory, I mean, in terms of the net greenhouse gas benefit, absolutely there's going to be one. Whether it's economical in the terms of carbon finance, it depends on the scale. Yeah, there's a question from Boone. Well, you're talking about reestablishing forest in a riparian area, right? Yeah, definitely. There is that's a good point to raise. I mean, and we've focused on the restoration component of this. We've talked about that conservation methodology is coming along. I mean, in the context of the U.S., we haven't thought there's a huge potential for conservation because we've always figured that the U.S. Army Corps and state laws pretty much have prohibit conversion of wetlands already. So if there's a legal requirement that prevents you from conversion, then it falls outside the carbon market. But there could be, maybe there are instances, that there are. I don't know how the tidal forested wetlands, if those are under, what sort of regulations they're under here in Pacific Northwest, and if they prevent conversion, new conversion.
Doesn't the 1,000-acre rule of thumb kind of apply to a fairly cohesive piece of land versus a whole bunch of little pieces all over the place in terms of the cost?
It depends. I think it's always better to have a contiguous piece of land, but what's really important is that if those lands, even if they're dispersed, are homogeneous, so that you can sort of selectively sample those. You may have some additional sort of costs in terms of like travel between sites, but in theory, like the sample size shouldn't, if they're homogeneous, shouldn't increase if they're contiguous or non-contiguous. But another important point is also like your just other administrative costs that aren't included in our carbon costs, about like, hey, I got to get all these landowner agreements signed. If I got to do that 100 times versus one time, that's gonna be a problem too. So you do want to be working in larger areas. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here. I'm just going to make one last point on RCO funded land that I've already made, but that there's some guidance that's come out, and this is a result of the King County carbon project that is under development. It includes some land that was funded with RCO money, and their legal counsels looked at this and said carbon projects on those lands would be okay so long as there was nothing recorded on title that would compete with the rights of the RCO, as so long as it complied with the deed of right that was signed for that funding. And one of the big things there is that it doesn't result in overall impairment of the objective of the funding, whether it be habitat conservation, recreation, salmon habitat restoration. But it shouldn't. It's just a source of funding, so it shouldn't impair the use of that property. They did say it should be identified in the project agreement going forward. And they also said it needs to comply with the use of income rules. So there are rules that the RCO has said that any funding, any income that's generated on those lands has to be compatible with the intended use. It has to be used to cover project costs. It has to be consistent with the value of the services furnished, so like a fair market. And those aren't really, those don't seem to present any issues with respect to carbon offset funding. So I think the good news is if there's land that's been restored or acquired with the RCO funding, that there appears that there's no sort of limitations of that funding that would prevent carbon project development. Okay. I know we're running behind, so any other questions, I'm happy to talk over.
Can I just ask a quick question about mineral rights? Where mineral rights are retained, has that ever been a problem?
Yeah, we didn't ask or look into mineral rights.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Right, just to take us to the lunch, I'm going to summarize some of the research questions which came up, and so the information gaps that were emerging as we we're going through this analysis. So just to go back and summarize those. We'd also think a little bit about what the extension of potential carbon projects could be within the landscape that we might explore when we're looking at kind of a holistic landscape-based approach. But before I do that, just want to recap why we came to this place as opposed to other places. And it was really the high resilience aspects of the coastal systems here which have very high potential. We need to really recognize that this part of the world, the wetlands have a lot of really high potential for resilience against climate change. for a number of reasons. There's a whole suite of of wetland types, and so with migration, one wetland type can replace another. The topography here is really good. You know, when you think of the Snohomish, you have a gradual slope that moves up slope. You're not up against a cliff or anything like that. So with silverise, there's space for habitats to migrate, which is often or sometimes a limiting factor when we think about these projects. Spelled incorrectly, but the vegetation productivity is very high. When we look, for instance, at EB Island, you know, Lingby sedge and other species here, they're really socking in the carbon, which is building marshes. So EB Island, that site was looked at actually by Battelle. I think it was even Ron that did it. Where's Ron? Did the analysis some decades ago. They identified that those marshes were building at a centimeter per year, just under a centimeter per year, constantly for 40 years. And so very resilient marsh building capabilities. Very high sediment supply, which is very important for building marshes. You can see the size of the arrows, it's enormous. And so sediment supply is very good. There's a lot of restoration activity. So this is a kind of a cultural thing. People are ready to do this. There's community awareness. There's discussions going on between different landowners. And there's political awareness. So when we think about where restoration can happen, this is a really good place to be. And so that got us really interested in the carbon financing part of it. So let's look at the questions which have come up and where the data gaps are to try and refine this a bit better. And I'll just run through them, and feel free to chip in with comments. Carbon sequestration rates. We have some values for the existing wetlands in certain places, particularly the work that we did earlier in the Snohomish in 2014 with John Ribsig. But we have very few data for restoring sites. This is actually a US whole issue. Everybody likes to work in natural systems. We have very little data for restoring sites for carbon accumulation rates. Carbon sequestration rates within forested tidal systems, within the soil, but within the biomass too. Our upland Sitka spruce, do they accumulate carbon within the biomass at the same rate or different rate to wetland Sitka spruce? That's an open question as far as we can tell. And then, this wet pasture, particularly with reed canary grass, that's come up as a bit of a surprise. We're seeing there's some indication, our data set is extremely small, there's some indication that there's sustained carbon accumulation rates in some of these areas which are becoming wet. But how long does that go on for is a big question. And that really affects the baseline question as part of this. So what's the answer to that? Methane emissions. This has always been one of our problems when trying to develop these kind of projects, both within the baseline and within the project setting. So it was great to get some of Scott Bridgham's data, but really what are the methane emissions? When we look at for instance, the CCAP data for here, it's recognized as palustrine wetlands. The stuff behind the dike is recognized as a wetland. It's not recognized as a grassland. So we might be underestimating the methane emissions quite a bit in the Snohomish, but we've used the data source that we have. The point was brought up in the discussion, which I've added here. The baseline assumption that we used was that we're starting with wet pasture, which of course is a very high bar to begin with the baseline. It would bring it down into that corner of the sensitivity box if you're thinking about agricultural lands which are not grasslands, and also if you were doing that, recognizing the cattle part in the baseline setting. So you'd have to factor that in and then think about the leakage analysis. Just one point I'll make. When we look at the Snohomish, if you go to the Skagit and you go to the Snohomish and you look at the difference of the landscape, the Skagit has very little carbon left in the landscape at all. You're standing on bare mineral soils, which have got very little carbon in it. And you come to the Snohomish and there's carbon everywhere. It's just everywhere. The wetlands are full of it. Even the areas with leaky tide gates like DD6, that's full of carbon. There's carbon everywhere in the Snohomish. It's a carbon-rich environment. And so clearly the baseline condition is very important when we think about this. The point was brought up about changes in sea level rise as well. That's a question about how that will affect methane emissions. As water tables rise, areas which have low methane emissions because they're drained will begin to have higher methane emissions as the water table gets into the root zone. But there's also salinity changes. Lateral fluxes in carbon. This is, we talked about the issues with allochthonous carbon. What is the fate of carbon that's exported from wetland biomass and soils? Wetlands are exporting all the time. Some of that gets buried somewhere else. But how much? So that's not included in the methodology right now. The fate of eroded carbon, if a wetland erodes, what's the fate of that also? That needs to be factored in. But then what's the fate of this allochthonous carbon which is passing through the estuary? If carbon's coming down a river and it ended up in the coastal zone and it would have been remineralized and gone back to the atmosphere, but if the wetland sequesters it on the way, then that carbon is actually being removed from the system. And so therefore the analysis that we do, and we subtract that allochthonous carbon out, we're being overly conservative, because if it hadn't been for the wetland restoration project, it would have gone back to the atmosphere. So that's a request also for the scientists in the room to help us understand the fate of carbon transport through the system. And then systems of particular interest, forested tidal wetlands. We've all heard the discussion there. It'd be really great to see if we can advance the information on forested tidal wetlands, particularly restoring forested tidal wetlands, carbon stock change there. Again, on emergent marshes, restoring systems, but also we just don't have much data on wet grasslands. And though I hate to say it, maybe a carbon project is actually just going from potato fields to wet grasslands. And that's a very simple project if the numbers work out. And the restoration, you take it further, it's a good restoration project, but it's not a carbon project. So we need to understand better, what is this step up in wet grasslands when we create them. So if we were trying to connect together, taking the whole landscape approach, what are the range of carbon projects, or the improvements in carbon management, not necessarily a carbon finance project, but improvements in carbon management, what's out there. And I put the one at the top in, it'll be more of interest maybe in the Skagit tomorrow, well, here too. But, what can people do on agricultural land to improve their practices, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? What can they be doing to improve soil carbon content? Just as we mentioned, ag land converted to pasture or wet grasslands. What are the opportunities there? Ag land, non-pasture converted to wetlands. We shied away from that one, but that would be a better carbon project than starting with wet pasture. But also, maybe the project is including wet pasture as just an interim phase. We just recognize that as being a step towards a wetlands carbon project. So you're not starting with a baseline of wet grasslands, you're starting with a potato field or something like that, and wet grasslands is a step in the restoration pathway. We didn't find a lot of examples, but restoring tidal wetlands and saline conditions, of course, doesn't have the methane issue. You're in a system which is dominated by a lot of freshwater flows here. Forested carbon projects, entitled freshwater forested restoration. That seems to be beneficial within a landscape where we could even generate carbon financing for. And one that we didn't find a lot of examples for, but one that we have theoretical support for, is just restoring saline flows back to where there's impounded freshwater wetlands. And we looked for some of those in the landscape, and we didn't find a lot of examples in the sites we were looking for. But are there areas where you have salt water on the outside, you've got fresh water on the inside, there's a barrier in between, and you can remove the barrier and increase the salinity. But we didn't find a lot of examples in this setting. And I think that's it. So, Kurt, with the microphone, please.
Map showing the Snohomish estuary and it being largely forested. I would suggest that that it may not have been as there may have been a combination of forest as well as scrub areas, and your scenarios, you go to a Sitka forest condition or a Sitka riverine forest, but there is also another scenario of being a shrub environment, and what kind of carbon sequestration goes on there is potential another area to explore.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe there's some sub-scrub environment in between. We didn't look at that one particularly. Scrub-shrub data is, when we've been working on the national inventory across the entire U.S., data sets on scrub-shrub are particularly limiting as well. Yeah, I'll leave it there. But yes, that's a good point, Kurt.
So I just wanted to mention, my name is Michelle Topman. I work for the Tulalip Tribes. I'm the GIS specialist, but I also have a very strong background in soil science.
Hey.
And so what's happened in a lot of these areas that we're restoring is there's been significant subsidence during agriculture.
Yeah.
And so the idea of reestablishing a spruce wetland there, you're going to have to bring in a lot of fill or something. And I don't particularly like that idea. So I'm just kind of curious. This whole time I've been wondering, like, how are we going to get these spruces to grow when the elevation's too low?
No, this is a very important point. Let's clarify this one. You had Sitka spruce and you had scrub shrub and much of the estuary historically. It subsided. In those locations, just as where the restoration projects are now, you're going to get back emergent wetlands. And with sea level rise, they may stay emergent wetlands for a very long time, if not indefinitely. So when you're looking for areas for putting Sitka spruce back in the landscape, it's further upslope. It's probably where the restoration projects are not happening now. Maybe around the top end of EB Island, DD6 might be the right elevation, drainage to District 6, and then upslope from there. You know, when you're really heading into the lower river, where it's still tidally influenced, you're probably looking in that area to do your forested wetlands. Would you agree with that? You'd be in the GIS.
Am I on? Okay.
There you are.
Those aren't areas I spend a lot of time looking at, so I would have to actually sit down with some layers and really analyze the data.
Yeah.
I'm about to get some new elevation data.
That's good. So I think, you know, the positive side is that you're not trying to create Sitka spruce where you've already created emergent tidal wetlands. You're creating new forested tidal wetlands on new lands. But of course, somebody owns those lands.
Steve, could I actually add to that comment, to your response to that comment?
Okay, then you can. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add that we're actually sitting in the room with one of the pioneers of using mounds for restoration, Craig Cornu. 20 years ago, started using on Coos Bay, started using logs as the basis of kind of mounding up some dirt over logs to try to get some higher elevation areas and subsided restoration areas. And we learned about this, and we've just done a study of looking at some mounds in Nooksack and some mound restoration on the Columbia River and some on the outer coast of Oregon, in a couple of locations, including that. So that's one option, is if you have like excavated materials on site from, say, restoring the channels, trying to do some pilot channels or restore the channels, is to use that kind of mound technique. They're using it on the outer coast as kind of hedging their bets against sea level rise also. There's a couple different kind of rationales that have been used for that.
Okay, thank you, Haida. Mike?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to your initial or your last statement about where spruce forests could be reintroduced, and we really need to start looking upriver quite a ways, even past where EB Slough breaks off the main stem of the Snohomish. We've got an area called marshlands, which is heavily agricultural now. It's not, it doesn't really fit as well into that definition of being a freshwater wetland. It is very heavily ditched, very heavily drained, and there's a pump station that keeps it fairly dry.
Mm-hmm.
So the agriculture is still fairly successful there.
Yep.
There's a lot of corn, blueberries, as well as those entertainment style agriculture, lots of pumpkin patches and corn mazes and zombie shootouts and things like that. So there are, that is much higher territory. It's still tidally influenced. Those are areas, and still completely privately owned, with the exception of a little bit that the city of Everett owns. So that is an area that I think if the price was right, there could be some incentive for landowners there to switch to a carbon project rather than paintball. And those are areas that the salmon recovery world is not having a lot of success because ag is very entrenched there. It's a place where we've backed way off our push to get salmon restoration done in those areas. I think those would be key areas to focus because you can also, if you added enough landowners together, you could get to that hectare threshold in some of those places. So
Yeah,
keep that in mind.
I think that's very good. And the idea would be to try and look in places where there's not already restoration taking place and expand the type of habitats that are going into the ground. I wonder, I don't know the answer to this, and I wonder the question, is an interim phase, as a landowner's thinking about this, if you grow Sitka spruce, can you grow it in a dry land condition, say within a parcel surrounded by agriculture, and then as other landowners come on board, think about restoring it to freshwater tidal down the line? So is it something that is quite a resilient step? I say shaking heads, no?
Generally, when you're restoring a pasture that has some remaining spruce, it drowns because of the subsidence that she mentioned. It's too subsided. If it's going to be well established in that drier condition, then it's going to die from anoxic stress on the roots.
So if it was a system that was high in the Snohomish, so it's above, so it would be above high water now, but it just has to be dry, and so you start growing trees
for future resilience.
For future resilience.
It's a good question.
So it's a question. Okay. I'm sorry. Hold on a sec.
To a certain degree, I guess to a certain degree earlier you were presenting the notion that this is 0 to 40 years, and when I think of doing Sitka spruce restoration, a lot of that production is coming after 40.
Mm-hmm.
The example of the Snohomish estuary and where Sitka spruce are currently growing, if you look at Otter Island, which has never been diked whatsoever, it's fully forested and it's low, below EB, below DD6, and it's got large, well-established Sitka spruce on it, probably some cedar in the field, right, Mike? Yeah. So I think that where it can grow in the estuary is further down than you were saying, but I think that happens on mounds or on nurse logs that take 50, 60 years to get to that point to establish and build a sedimentation to the point that is your restoration community.
Yeah.
This thought leads me into your earlier comments about RCO and other restoration and how to use this in combination with it. And I'm wondering how much funding is there, and or what is my motivation to establish a Sitka spruce forest in mound and hummock and plant container stock versus the much lower cost of restoration of allowing natural seed dispersion from emergent wetland species. So the price of doing a Sitka spruce restoration project comparison to emergent wetland restoration project is significant, and I don't know if TerraCarbon funding would offset that significance.
Yeah. And I'm going to bring up a slightly different topic. I wasn't sure whether to talk about this, but I'm going to throw it in since we talk about alternative funding. One of the things that's going on further down south, where it's still not raining, is down in California, they have a series of bond measures related to climate resilience. And they have one on the ballot right now, coming up for 2020. This is the second one. So they had one allocated and funded in 2016, which was also for $8 billion, and it's for trying to improve climate resilience across California. And various things in there, wildfires, particularly a big issue for us. But in there is $1 billion for protecting fish and wildlife from climate risks. There's $750 million for restoring wetlands and improving ocean conditions. And so this type of climate resilience bonds, it may negate the need for carbon financing, or it could be something that you can supplement. So where things aren't financially viable, there may be other, you can try and layer some of these things together. So I'm just putting this out there that there are some of these big bond measures which are gaining traction. The green bond market in 2011 was worth $0, and last year it was, I think, $240 billion. So it's gone up really fast. And in California, it's taking advantage of some of that green bond financing for these kind of projects. But of course, with a bond, you have to pay the money back to somebody. It's a loan. It's not a gift. But they are gaining interest. And so California is negating the use of trying to do carbon projects in wetlands. They're just using the bond financing at this stage just to get more wetlands in the ground. So interestingly, the client base in California has moved from just being NGOs, predominantly NGOs and state departments, state authorities. It's increasingly now flood management agencies who are restoring wetlands using bond financing. Okay. Oh, sorry. So actually, we wrote a report on blue bond financing. So if anybody wants to learn a bit more about blue bond financing, go to our website, and we have a number of reports on this topic. Climate change in the Sacramento Delta. Okay. Any other discussion points, or should we break for lunch? Greg?
I think we're breaking for lunch. Thank you, Steve, and all previous speakers for everything. So, Steve, Emmett Maddox, I guess I don't really need this. We have lunch, so let us know what we should do.